I really see my function as, there's several things, but ultimately a translator, which is to take the creative direction and the brief from DP and director and, frankly, to translate that into technical operations.
Peter Doyle joins me on this episode of the Colorist Podcast. Peter has worked on some of the most popular films of all time, like the Lord of the Rings Trilogy, Harry Potter films, and The Matrix. He has collaborated with major directors Tim Burton, the Coen Brothers, and the Wachowski Siblings. Peter helped pioneer the digital intermediate process we use today, working with a groundbreaking software package then known as Colossus. This would later evolve into Autodesk Lustre and is used on many big-budget films today. The look of his projects can be vastly different, from the hyper-saturated look of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory to the bleak and faded style of Inside Llewyn Davis. Peter is constantly pushing the boundaries of color grading. On this podcast, we talk about making the transition from visual effects to color, working on films from completely opposite genres, making color work look invisible, advantages of knowing the technical background of color science, and how ACES works in his grading pipeline. And now, here's Peter Doyle. Thanks, Peter, for coming onto the podcast.
Oh, well, thanks for having me.
So you started around the 90s, but you were mainly focused on doing visual effects. What brought you over to doing solely just color?
I've been doing visual effects really just as digital had kicked in. So I was working with Kodak over in Rochester sitting on digital intermediate system, as they called it at the time. And whilst I was doing visual effects, I was mainly focusing on the kind of compositing and color side of visual effects. To an extent, I had always liked the color aspect of compositing, and in some ways had kind of just been waiting for the digital technology to be practical enough to grade in the way that people were kind of grading pretty much commercials using telecine chains, but at a much higher res and with the control that compositing came in. And sitting on kind of off of that, whilst obviously at the time the technology wasn't as fast and as real time as it was now, it was quite good. So that's pretty much kind of what I focused on. So then to do the first project where I'd really made the move exclusively over to grading was Lord of the Rings, when Andrew Lesnie, the DP, and Barry Osborne, the producer, and Peter, we all had the discussion about how to make Middle-earth look unworldy, have some kind of magical look. And it was felt, obviously, digital compositing would be the way to go, but to try and do an entire film through Nuke or at the time, Shake was just not really practical. So we looked at different alternates. So working with New Line Cinema, we basically commissioned a software package that was really streamlined to kind of do the functions of grading in a more practical way than perhaps a compositing package. So it kind of went from there.
Is this what eventually became Lustre, or was that something else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was the Jasperini brothers when they had their little company in Budapest with Colorfront. And I approached Aaron and Mark and we kind of spec'd out some basically what this thing should do, and then they wrote it, and then it kind of grew from there.
So as you were saying, you've had the opportunity to work with a lot of talented directors and DOPs. Do you think that they shaped the way that you approach grades?
Without question. I really see my function as, there's several things, but ultimately a translator, which is to take the creative direction and the brief from DP and director and, frankly, to translate that into technical operations. It sounds rather dry and perhaps a little academic to kind of reduce the craft of color grading into kind of a technical language, but ultimately that's it. If a DP asks for kind of, can you give me like a flashed blacks with kind of a blue hue? I mean, I will translate that into, while we tone map a binary matte so that we can lift the blacks on the curve and perhaps run a blur or a spatial filter to, emulate what a flashed black in a film lab would do. So it's kind of like a translation process, in my opinion. And obviously, I'd like to think I have my own kind of thoughts about that. But I see my job as really two things, and that's to take on board what's asked for and to try to the best of my ability to understand what that is, and to then to translate that into a series of technical operations. And then B is to kind of join in that discussion and say, okay, so this is what you're thinking, and now that we've seen that, what do you think about this or this? Definitely they shape what we do, I think, anyway.
Yeah, and the kinds of films that you've worked on are so vastly different. As you had said, you'd worked on Lord of the Rings, but you've also done movies like Big Eyes and Inside Llewyn Davis, and most people would be really surprised that the same colorist had worked on all three of those projects. Does your approach change based on the different style of these films?
No. I mean, there's certain practical decisions. I mean, certainly Inside Llewyn Davis was Joel and Ethan. It was pretty much an indie film, so the budgets are a little more limited. In some ways, the approach changes. The cold reality is that budgets will dictate to an extent the approach. Then the second is that the relationship is a little different because it's always like a three-way conversation between the DP, the director, and the colorist. So that kind of relationship and how that evolves can change. Directors are human beings, surprisingly, and so they're just different people. So that there's just a different dynamic involved. So I guess that's a very long-winded way to answer the question, which I guess I could have answered in that the approach changes not so much in process, but really in terms of reference and the evolution of the particular look or style of the film. And that becomes very dependent on the director and the little world that the director has. So, if you think of each film as really its own little kingdom, and, if you're working with the Wachowskis or the Coens or Peter Jackson or Tim Burton, they have their own, it really is their own little world, and that they will work with their team, specifically their production designer, their conceptual artist, and their DP. So you're really coming into a particular family. So the dynamics is very different, obviously, with each kind of group unto itself. The objective is the same, which is a film that reflects the creative intent of everyone involved, but that process tends to be a little different. So it's different in perhaps the references and how you go about trying to find the looks involved. So somebody like Tim Burton and the way you would, at least I go about finding specific looks for those films, it's quite a different process to something like the Coen Brothers, which again is quite a different process to David Yates from Fantastic Beasts. So that's perhaps what changes. The process itself is, we're still making 2K DCPs and we're still using software and we still use cameras. So that side of it's kind of the same. Interestingly, I found that the big change is actually the language, just the actual verbal, the language and the references and frankly the assumptions of the understanding and the references changes.
So do you feel like there's some directors that will give you more freedom Or are there other directors that say are pretty hard line, they have a real defined idea of what it's supposed to look like?
Yes, although to an extent, the directors that have a very specific look in mind would probably not be booking somebody like me to, grade the film. It's a little bit more of a collaboration. Certainly some directors do have a specific intent in mind, and certainly the process will start with a pretty clear idea of where it should go. And that's why I think it's very important that my job is, as I said, is to deliver on that. But then in the process, because it is an evolution, to perhaps also offer an alternate if there is an understanding of what the intent is. And that's more about the emotional intent of the film rather than a literal interpretation. So obviously you'll get the script, and, if it's night, winter, raining New York, I mean, that's pretty specific in where it's to be. And obviously the DP is the first point of reference in defining that look. The choice of lights, budget will then dictate how much they get to wet down the streets. Night is also, is it like very neon, modern, one car Y kind of world, or is it vintage where there's frankly no electric lights at all? So it's all gas. And they're all decisions definitely driven by DP production design, motivated or informed by script and director. But that's then looping back on the emotional intent. So night is to be very scary night, or a happy night, or a romantic night, and then it's kind of, I see my job where to kind of come in where lighting and lenses and production design can't take it any further. And then we start to use whatever image processing tools are available to, take that further. So if it's to be an evil, scary night, that, might mean super heavy blacks, very monotone, but, it's kind of then up to your interpretation and then offering up whatever you think that could be. That's where you could say, yes, directors have a very specific idea, but it would be it's kind of unusual if a director has an absolute hard line visual idea of exactly how this thing should look, because even to say, okay, I want a crisp red, blah, 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 that can really, even that is kind of open to interpretation. And it's that kind of mutual investigation is what gives, at least for me, quite a lot of, that's kind of why I do the job. That's what I find quite interesting.
The great thing about some of your work, though, is you get a brief from something like Inside Llewyn Davis where they say this should be sad, but yet you don't fall into all the general pitfalls that somebody would just say, well, let's make it blue because it's sad. You actually have taken it in a completely different direction.
Yeah, well, that's what I really like about, say, working with Bruno Delbano, great DP and a consummate professional, and also technically perfect. So it means that, when we agree, perhaps what's needed, Bruno's like amazing, and he will really go off and I mean, say we build some look and agree, okay, a contrast ratio of 6 stops with a color temperature of blah, blah, blah is really what we need. I mean, the guy's amazing, and that's really then how he will light it. So in the case of Llewyn Davis, it really was quite an academic approach, and that, okay, album cover, freewheeling, it's New York, winter, 60s, you can't get any more specific brief than that. I mean, it's like it's the same street, the same clothes, but the twist, which is where then you've got very clever directors like the Coens, and that's, but not black and white. So then that opens up like a whole thing, in that, okay, it's to be inspired by this album cover, but, we don't want a black and white. So then just basically, you get the script and in that case, sitting down with Bruno and really just having an interpretation. And again, where I feel my job is it's like translation, and that's to be really quite literal about it. And it's to go, okay, this is a film from the 60s. So, we're doing close of the period. So everything is to be as it was. So it's a period film. So what would a film shot at that time look like today? I mean, like literally. So, what would a color film from the 60s look like today? So we then investigated, okay, if we shoot this on 16 mil, what would it look like? And it really, raised a lot of questions. But along the way, what became apparent is that we look at film print, as in sitting in 2016, when we look at films from that period, unless there are a few of us that are very special and blessed by being able to reach into the archive and run a genuine color print from that time, we are looking at high-quality telecine/restored films from that time. So we're not actually looking at a genuine film print from that time. We're in fact looking at a modern transfer of a print from that time. So I thought, why not just pretend that the film was, that we just found this old film print from the time. And, so that would mean that you would be running a 50-year-old color film print. And that would mean that it will have absolutely, and that would mean Eastman Kodak print, even though there was still that Technicolor 3-strip process still being used, but that was like really expensive and still being used. And because it was such a cumbersome process with the cameras, you wouldn't be shooting kind of a New York on the street, film on 3-strip. It would be, handheld, like the French New Wave, Godot, that kind of thing, on a kind of Eastman Kodak stock. So if you're saying an Eastman Kodak stock color, 50 years old, it just would have faded to all hell. It just, and you go, okay, faded, which part? And it would be, the green layer would fade through to magenta. So based on that, we really did just build a transform and basically a look that was kind of inspired by the idea of a super faded film print, but still color. So then having built truly a literal interpretation of what that would look like, you go, okay, well, there's no way we can sit through 2 hours of this film because it just looks exactly like it did, just way too much. So then it was like an interpretation of, what's good about this, what are the visual cues about this, and it became apparent that just by sneaking back in the skin tones, which then gave the audience something to really lock onto in terms of the film, we felt that was kind of interesting. And then the other part of that was because it was winter and it would be low light in the 60s, film stocks really were not that fast, which meant that you would be shooting very wide open, and high-speed lenses really didn't make an appearance until the late 60s, early 70s. So you're talking pretty bad, crappy lenses shooting wide open. So they're just going to flare and be super soft. So we emulated that, in the DI room and really just gave it that super soft, slightly blurry image, which is what an old lens of the time would look like. At least I felt or proposed that would be our memory, or that's kind of a modern day response to what a film from that time looked like. And then in terms of skin tone, well, we're talking people that are, students, musicians that really have no money, so they're not going to be that healthy. And it's winter, and it's New York, so they're going to be super pale. So we got this thing of like the idea of adding a skin tone, but then having the in-joke of that they're pale anyway. So having done that, which is quite a literal, very analytical just approach to it, that's how we came up with that look. And obviously along the way, you have a few philosophical guidelines, which is, no, we're not going to make it sepia. No, we're not going to make it black and white. Obviously, you just come up with a couple of manifestos, if for no other reason, just to kind of start to narrow down your options. Because, if you sit in front of a box with an image that you can do anything with, you're not going to get anything done because you just end up in this like loop of madness. So I've just found that, particularly with Bruno, we will just come up with just a manifesto, and then and that kind of just helps us not slip into some of the cliches. At least I hope it doesn't.
Yeah. I mean, you've also said, too, especially on these higher budget films, that you need to grade a film 3 times before getting to what it really needs to look like. Is there something about seeing it incorrectly that actually can make that powerful as well?
Yeah, absolutely. It really, you just need to see how the film runs from start to finish as an arc and how the different scenes work with each other. So it starts to become like a mix and match model, which is, you'll have a couple of quite radically different looks for all these different scenes, but it's then how do all these different looks work with each other. If we take Llewyn Davis, there were actually, on the table a few different interpretations of that for the different scenes, but once we ran the film and just had a feel for it, and once T-Bone put in his music, and, once we kind of had a feel for what the film was going to be, it became apparent that it would actually work better to, in fact, have the one look for the entire film, which then pulled it back together into this kind of, day in a life circular type thing. So, that was like one of the few films where we, in fact, wanted to take out a color arc, because you really are ending on the same shot that you started with.
Right, because that serves the story.
Exactly.
It's futile, what we're doing, and it should all be that same level.
Yes.
One thing that I really have noticed in your work, too, is you constantly are pushing the boundaries. So on Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, I understand you pushed the limit to what the color could be printed on the film. And something we as colorists do is we're constantly thinking about rules like don't crush blacks, don't blow out highlights. And with a lot of these things, there's such high stakes. What gives you the courage to push the limits of all of these so-called rules?
I don't know. I'm just an angry young man. Well, they're not really rules, because I spent a lot of time working with manufacturers. I've spent a lot of time with Fuji in Tokyo, where I worked on the record out stock, the RDI, where we really changed the blue layer to get it sharper. And we actually had in development a new print stock where we had more silver, but basically it was a print stock that had much deeper blacks. We cleaned up the whites, so it meant that the skin tones kind of became more Eurasian rather than very classic Kodak North American, which, as you would expect from Fuji. But they pulled out of the print business. But to answer your question, they're not really rules, and you really have to ask, well, who said that you shouldn't crush the blacks? It's like, sorry, it's all about what's on the screen. There's a standard joke when I work with different colorists when it's like a really big film, and I have colorists helping out on rushes or set grades, I'll ban the vector scopes and the waveforms because they're just, I don't know what purpose they serve. Certainly I will have a high quality, very high quality filtered, very large histogram, which allows you then to check for when rules are being broken. And I consider rules that are being broken to be things that compromise the image quality. So, a low bit depth, crushing whites, or more frankly, clipping. But clipping, if it's, an ugly image, it's more things like that, or, like noise, or dead pixels, there's technically things that are just unpleasant to look at. But in terms of other boundaries, it's not even they're there to be broken. It's like who actually said that they were a boundary anyway? Because, in terms of color on a print stock, I've always been amazed how animation films can, get the colors that they can. They can just look absolutely beautiful. So why not do that with live action films? Particularly something with like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, which is, is it real life? Is it an animation? Tim comes from his background of drawing and animation. So again, if you approach it with a philosophy or a commitment that, okay, this is an animation film, but it's just shot with real people on a real set, but the aesthetics are about animation, why not? So that's what was driving that film. Plus, it was kind of a bit of an homage to, the original film was shot back. So the idea of just having these incredibly rich, somewhat hyper-real films or colors was the motivating force there.
Yeah, sometimes we actually have this weird conflict as colorists too, because there's this great quote that says, I work really hard to make it look like I did nothing, right? As a colorist, you don't want to really call too much attention to what you've done, but you also want to support the story. So how do you really walk that line?
Oh, yeah. That's a constant thing. And there is something fascinating, and that's I'm in the process of remastering for HDR a couple of films. And you could say films from each decade tend to have their own look. And that's really driven by the technology, either by the print stocks or the lenses at the time. Everyone's reaching for the vintage lenses to get that vintage look. But what I'm noticing, and I'm hearing this discussion elsewhere as well, and that's, you could say that the 2000s was really about DI. It had an enormous impact on the look of films. So pretty much by about the 2007, 2008, a DI and a DCP was pretty much the standard. But then with the digital cameras, the signature of the DP has been somewhat removed in that, it's kind of it's the holy grail that every color looks the same, particularly, now with ACES and the IDTs and the uniform color space. And now that, frankly, everybody knows what they're doing, it's all really settled down. But what's happened along the way is that the look of films has kind of been pulled back a little bit because the looks were kind of dating the film a little bit. So certainly I think with, something like Lord of the Rings, we got away with it with all this like pro mist and all this kind of magical stuff. But that kind of makes sense because that it was the film of the time and the aesthetics, but you couldn't do a film like that now. Otherwise it would start to look like, something out of the 60s with like David Hamilton photography or whatever. But I think striking that balance between the look overtaking the film or not, that's just, I think, without being pretentious, that's just what taste is. As in, that's just, you will run the film with the team And again, it's important to run the full film in context, in a cinema, with some kind of temp sound, and it's intuitive. You will just know that, wow, the look's starting to take over here, or it's just feeling a little weak, or, this should be quite an ebullient moment. This should feel a little up. The casts should be looking great, but, we fell in love with our blacks to the point that it's starting to feel like some, super art film than instead of some happy film, for example. That's just about pacing, It's just like, when does an editor know to stop cutting? When does the sound mixer know when to pull back on the music and let the dialogue go? And I think it's very much the same with grading, and that's when do you know that the look is just starting to take over, or it's not appropriate? And it's just instinctual. I think it's just about finding that look, and will a period film handle another look? And sometimes, working with David Yates, say on Fantastic or Tarzan, we've really gone quite out there with our looks. But then we'll run it, and then we'll realize it's like, okay, the final kiss goodbye in whatever film, now that we've got the music, now that we've got the dialogue, now that we've got the cut, and then we've got the performance, and then we've got the look on top of it, it's like, it's just too much, it's like, it's just killing it. So, what do we pull back on? Do we pull back on the mix or the music or the grade or whatever? So it's just finding that sense of appropriateness, I think.
And you've done these really big films, Lord of the Rings, but now you've actually had the opportunity to do some things for the small screen as well. As I noticed, you recently did an episode of Black Mirror on Netflix. Working with the small screen, did that change anything about the way that you work?
Yeah, one of which was absolute terror, because I know nothing about broadcast specs, and it's like, sorry, scale, black, you've got legal, lifted, wowee. Okay, but fortunately with, working at Technicolor, there's like a solid team that, can help you with all that sort of thing. Yep, there were a few things, just the aesthetics of a light emitting screen, like a monitor, is certainly a very different sensation to a reflected image, a projection screen. The white point was something that took me a little while to get used to, D6.5 versus, D600 and D5. You don't have to be quite the perfectionist in some areas, because, it's a smaller screen. It's not like 60 feet wide. But then what I found interestingly is that in other areas, you actually need to be much better, because, the MTF of a monitor is actually a lot sharper. So technically, in some ways, you actually need to be more on top of certain things. But then in terms of aesthetics, it was interesting in that you could work with more contrast, which was not something I was really expecting. Because historically with monitors, I'm always just taking, the DI grade down to the 709 for the video deliverables. So you're always just trying to emulate, what you've done for the big screen. But to come up with a specific look for, say, Black Mirror, it was interesting that you could reach for and use more contrast, because there's kind of less flare on the image. So that was interesting.
Back to the technical stuff too, you were mentioning that you're working in HDR as well, and this is a huge thing for colorists, that we have the ability to see into shadows more, and we can brighten up images. What's been your experience working with it? Well,
I've actually done, bizarrely, quite a lot of HDR, both at 4,000 nit and 1,000 nit, and I might be saying something contentious, and that's, it's not that different. In that, Yep, you certainly have a lot more contrast or dynamic range. But like a soundtrack, when the digital sound came out, with Dolby SRD and then Atmos and the DTS, certainly you had more dynamic range, but you're not running an entire soundtrack at like full volume because so likewise you're not running the brightness of a grade at full 1,000 nits because it's just physically unpleasant. And likewise, a DP spends an awful lot of time on set building in their contrast ratios, with practical lights being just at the right thing and really relying on the lookup table because that's defining their look. So just because you can rip all that apart and now have the practicals screaming at like 1,000 nits, I mean, nobody actually wants it that way. So that's unfortunately just the manufacturers not understanding, frankly, the visual medium. And I think that will settle down over the next year when I think manufacturers finally understand and get sick and tired of being told by just about everyone, I'm sorry, but this is a really unpleasant image to look at. That said, to have that ability is fantastic, so, I don't know, muzzle flares and wand zaps and just real, like, interactive lighting cues to have that dynamic is great. And, to really be able to design in some, I don't know, some ectoplasmic life force thing, whatever that is, no longer does it have to be just a whiteout. It can actually be, some beautifully textured, slightly brighter image. But other than that, yeah, I mean, the blacks, the monitor, the actual blacks of the monitor are pretty good. We could always see those blacks anyway before. It's just that they were physically at a different, light level. So in some ways, my response to HDR is until somebody can really lock down on the ambient light level, it's kind of like you run the risk of it actually being a bit of an arms race. The brighter the monitor, you just turn up your ambient light level, and now you're back to where you are. But that said, there's a lot about it, to have, the monitors themselves are pretty good. The Dolby Pulsar obviously still has some way to go, but in principle, it's pretty good. And but even then, like the Sony 300, 1,000 nits full screen, it doesn't happen. So there's still a lot of issues there.
You ended up switching over to, you were previously on Lustre, as you had said before, even since its very inception. And then in around 2009, you switched over to Baselight. What made you choose that system over something else? The tool set and the image quality. Of all things, really, the image quality. It was full 16-bit float, and obviously I spent a lot of time with the team. So the whole approach to the color space concept, and it was very early days, but when ACES was a mere concept, it became clear that was going to be integrated quite well. So yeah. And you choose not to use the blackboard or the slate panels. So why don't you, since you have the ability to do that, why have you chosen not to use those? They're
too big. Or at least, again, for me, it's just really a pragmatic decision. I just had my little keyboard with a whole bunch of custom macros, baby tangent panel to, just give me the smooth controls, and works for me.
You also have a really strong technical and almost scientific knowledge of color. Do you think that it's important for other colors to have that same, mathematic background in color too, or?
I would say yes, just because it doesn't just makes it easier. You just feel more in control. But that said, there's still some, very fine colorists that work a little more intuitively. I would say yes, but then, that's just kind of my opinion.
Thanks for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thanks a lot.